Welcome back to this retrospective review of the first three Space Quest games that I originally bought here on GOG.com. As you see, I have the web page up in the background. It's going for the normal price of $10, basically. So I just want to go ahead and bring it up and do my review for these first three games because that's how it's packaged. But I do want to go ahead and point out one quick thing that if your preferred platform is Steam, you can get all six Space Quest games on Steam via this Space Quest collection. So that is an alternative for you all, depending on what platform you prefer to use. For me, obviously, I use GOG, so that's what I'm going to go with here. And one of the nice things about using this is you're not technically limited to using the environment that comes with the GOG version, in this case, Scum VM. So let me go ahead and I guess start by talking about these first three games from a graphic perspective. All three of them are using the EGA output that was available back in the 80s. So what that means is basically there's 16 colors on screen at once. The overall color palette was, I think, something like 64 colors or something, but it could only display 16 at a time. So yes, the color palette is a little bit limited, and they are definitely products of their time. But I will say that, even though with this limited color selection for the graphics, that all three of the games are still very colorful games. And I've actually seen, games from that time period that were much more rudimentary in their rendering of graphics. So with the resources they had available, they actually did a pretty good job. But yeah, definitely graphically, keep in mind they are a product of the 80s, and so you're not going to be blown away. Having said that, one of the biggest complaints that you see in multiple reviews on both Steam and GOG is everybody complaining about how the first Space Quest game, it's the original version that's available and not the VGA remake. And, when I look at it and I see people complaining about the lack of a VGA version of Space Quest 1, it does kind of make me question why. Because it just seems to me, in my experience, if I'm playing a game in VGA, the first one, and then the next two are going to be in EGA, it just seems like a downgrade to me. And it doesn't make sense, chronologically speaking, to play them in order like that. It would just seem weird to me. But for whatever reason, that is a big complaint that a lot of people have, that this doesn't have the VGA version. It doesn't affect me in any way, shape, or form. I think the way this package is, compiled, that all three are EGA, actually makes a lot more sense. So let's talk about the actual environment that these games are meant to run in. So all three of these games are meant to run in Scum VM, at the way that GOG has it packaged. So what I will say is, well, for starters, because I'm running Linux, I just used InnoExtract and I extracted all three of these games to a separate directory in my little games folder I have for my DOS games. And so for the first two games, I used my native Scum VM to play them, and it worked great. Um, so Scum VM for the first two games allows you to basically select the Tandy or PC Junior soundtrack for both of them, and that is quite a bit of an improvement over the PC speaker that I remember in the first Space Quest game from back in the day. It is a bit of an improvement, but it's only a slight improvement because there isn't really a lot of sound going on in the game other than mostly beeps and stuff of that nature. So yes, there's a little bit of improvement, but it's not like we're talking huge leap forward. Space Quest 3, on the other hand, I ran that in DOSBox because for me, I have an actual Roland MT32 hardware unit. And for some reason, when I was running Space Quest 3 in Scum VM, at least in the opening scene, there would be the specific note it would hit, and the MT32, it wouldn't stop playing that note. So you would hear that one note in the background, like a little hum, as it were, the whole way through the introduction. And that was just annoying to me. But once again, you have the option to run it however you want. And so I ran it with DOSBox X, and I guess just the DOS implementation is much better in DOSBox X, so the sound worked better there. And let's just go ahead and say that one of the things that Space Quest 3, its biggest advantage over the first two, is the fact that it has a soundtrack. Now, whether you're using the Sound Blaster soundtrack, or you're using the Roland MT32 soundtrack, either one is just a massive improvement over the first two games, just having that background sound going on. Now, personally, I recommend, if you don't have an MT32, then look into the MUT emulator so that you can use the MT32 sound, because it's just really good. Now, the Sound Blaster soundtrack isn't bad, but that MT32 sound, it's just so far ahead of its time, and there's just no going back once you've heard it. So definitely the soundtrack in Space Quest 3, especially with the MT32, it's definitely worth using that for sure. Now let's talk about storyline. So the first two Space Quest games, I do want to point out one of the big factors that they have over Space Quest 3 is they had a more focused storyline. So you kind of had a good idea of what your goals were in each of the two games. Like Space Quest 1, your first goal was, I got to get off this ship because these guys are trying to kill me. Get down to the desert planet. You do a little bit of roaming around, but it's not to the point where you don't know where you're going. You're like, okay, let me try to get through this desert. You go to the I forget the name of the place. It's something flats. Basically, you're trying to get to that spaceport, trying to get off the planet, and then make it back to the ship so you can stop the Sarians. So it's very focused as to what its storyline is. Space Quest 2, you get captured early on, so then you're stuck on this alien planet. So you're trying to get off, and then you're trying to basically, ruin Vohal's plans. So both of them have a very focused storyline, which is actually a good thing. Space Quest 3, the nice thing is it does pick up like immediately where Space Quest 2 left off, because Space Quest 2 does leave you on that bit of a cliffhanger. And so it's nice that it picks up right there, and you're basically trying to escape from the alien junk ship. So that part of it is pretty focused, storyline wise. But then after you get off the alien junk ship, you're like, now what? So for me, I just was like bumbling around the galaxy, and I basically stumbled through about 3/4 of the game, not knowing why I was doing the stuff that I was doing, but I just went ahead and kept on doing what I did. And then basically I found out, I was like, oh, this is why I'm doing everything, like pretty much close to the end of the game. So it definitely is not as focused as the first two games. But then again, it's also not really as linear as they are either, because theoretically I could have gone to the Monolith Burger. I could have made that my first stop. Then I could have gone to Fleeb Hut, and then from there to Ortega or whatnot. So it wasn't completely linear. There's a little bit of choice there. I'm not going to say it was like open world or anything, because it really wasn't. But so I guess what I'm saying is, for that lack of focus, you kind of, it reflected that in the actual storyline. But overall, the first two Space Quest games, Space Quest 3 having that soundtrack, it was such a big improvement over the first two games, because the first two games were very quiet. Like, you're sitting here just wandering around the desert or the alien planet, and there's just nothing going on. Maybe a couple of beeps or something here and there. There's just no sound. Whereas in Space Quest 3, you had that nice soundtrack playing in the background. So even though the storyline wasn't as focused as those two, the soundtrack makes up for it to the point where you almost don't mind as much. So anyway, one thing I will say that all three of these games suffer from is the fact that they can be very cryptic at times. And because this game is very much a keyboard driven game and it has a specific vocabulary that you have to use. So, like, you may have the right idea in your mind to get through the puzzle, but it wants a specific phrasing, an actual specific wording that you need to use. Otherwise, because they are rudimentary games, it's not going to be able to understand what you're trying to tell it. So in that case, one of the things I did is I went to this website, uh, Gamer Walkthroughs, and they have walkthroughs for all 6 of the Space Quest games. Now, if you're going to play through these games, I would definitely recommend you do not use the walkthrough until you just absolutely have no other choice. You're stuck and you don't know where to go. In which case, like a good half the time when I hit, you know, walls like that, I could look over here and found out, oh, I'm using the wrong word. It's looking for this word. And it literally can be something as simple as you got the wrong word. Other times, some of the puzzles themselves can be very cryptic and you're like, what am I supposed to do? Like, oh, I got to jump in a washer machine. Who knew? So some of the puzzles themselves can be pretty off the wall, as it were. But yeah, using a guide through like this is almost kind of necessary, unless you're a much better player at these kind of games than I am. And that's not really that hard of an accomplishment, to be honest with you, because I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm the greatest at these, because I'm not by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and there is one thing about this game, and this may be something that some players would find frustrating, is if you forget something early on in the game and you get like way further in the game and you're like, oh, I needed something from like an hour ago, but I can't go back anymore to get it. So this whole hour that I've been playing, I've lost all that progress. And so you just got to find an earlier save and just redo everything. Some people may consider that frustrating, but the thing is, once you've figured out a lot of the puzzles, and I had to backtrack quite a bit, actually, many times in these games, but once you've figured out the puzzles, you're like, okay, you remember pretty much everything that you did before, and you just go straight back to where it was, and you just kind of go through the motions. And so it's not really that detrimental when you forget something like that. But then again, make sure you have lots of different saves along the way so that you can minimize your loss of playthrough. But anyway, having said that, even if you do come across something like that, let's see, what, like the alien that kissed me in Space Quest 2. Well, I lost probably a good 45 minutes of playtime after that happened, because the downsides to that action didn't hit me till like I was on my way out of the freaking station at that point. So, but then again, I just loaded an earlier save and I played through everything. I knew exactly what to do, and it wasn't that hard. So these games aren't long games. I mean, you're talking about, even with my backtracking, have to do things over again, somewhere in the 3 to 4 hour range each game, maximum. So you could get through these games in less than 5 hours. Um, so yeah, definitely, it's not a bad thing that you have to do the backtracking and whatnot, because there's not really a lot of playtime in these games. And so when it comes to that, that's what I'd like to look at. The price. The price is $10 or $20 on Steam. Is the game worth full price? I don't think so. I think the game is probably one of those games that you would want to wait to get on sale, at least for these first three games, because they're fun, but once you've played through them, there is no replay value. I mean, you could maybe try to go back and see if you can max out your points. But I mean, even just playing through the game normally, I mean, there's not like there's a lot of side quests or things basically like, hey, what could I have done to get an extra 5, 8 points? So replay value is pretty low in all these games, to be fair. Um, I mean, they're good games, but they're definitely a product of their times, which is the 80s. And they do have these nice little nostalgic things thrown in there. So, like, if you grew up in the 80s, you're like, oh, yeah, I caught that little pop culture reference. And so that's things like that will bring a smile to your face. But at the same end of the day, I mean, at $10, you may not even get, a 10 hours worth of playing out of these games. So yeah, definitely I'd say wait for it to go on sale for sure. And because they are cryptic, I mean, you're going to have to use a guide most likely. I probably used it for about 25% of the game, give or take, because some of the puzzles were just that, you know, I had no idea what I was doing. So it definitely is one of those things if you're easily frustrated and you don't like stuff like that, that's another, checkbox off of why would you pay full price for it. But if we're going to go ahead and give it a score using the GOG method, which, out of 5 stars. Oh, look, first review complaining about no VGA version of Space Quest 1. What would I give this overall collection? Well, GOG doesn't allow you to use half stars, unfortunately, but I can use them. And so, in my guess, I'd say this is probably about a 3.5. That's what I would say it is. Now, if I were to, rate the games individually, I'd say the first two games are probably a 3 because that lack of a soundtrack really does hurt them. And then I would bump the third game up to a 3.5 because the soundtrack makes all the difference in the world when playing this game. But the storyline is a little more jumbled and not nearly as focused as the first two games, so that does hurt it a little bit. So I would say, yeah, definitely overall 3.5. But anyway, that's my thoughts on these games. I mean, if you have played the VGA version of Space Quest 1, which I have not, if you feel like, telling me why you think that version of the game is worth dinging this score for, go ahead and write down there why the VGA version is so much better. I assume, obviously, it's not just graphics. I'm assuming there's obviously a soundtrack in it, and I'm sure that would be good. But if you do play the Space Quest 1 VGA remake and you go to play Space Quest 2 or 3 afterwards, how does that feel? Does it feel like an obvious downgrade? And are you okay with that? Because me personally, I would much rather than feel like I'm actually progressing from one game to the next. So anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care.